Thank you, Ingrid, and it's humbling to follow the people that came before me here. Just on a correction, I'm no longer the principal of the College of Business and Law. I recognised when I went into that role it was an extra managerial role that didn't add value. So I changed it from being principal and empowered the two deans who actually drive two magnificent schools, and I just work as a chairman, which is a sort of a notional function that adds a limited enough level of value. I'm very honoured to be here today. I don't have the capacities of my previous speakers to speak on some of the detail of the IR world that's in the public sector at the moment. And I was one of those people that Ingrid sort of referred to, the public servant who didn't make themselves very visible. If I had a head of hair, I would be one of these grey people who stood in the background. But I was talking earlier on that one of the reasons I am here is because I had an encounter with a butcher at a counter there recently, and it was about 6:30, 7, and I was surprised that the counter in the supermarket was still open. And I said, "Oh, it's great you're still here." He said, "Yeah, I am. I'm not a civil servant." And that really hurt me. I am proud, very, very proud to have been a public servant. I'm very proud to continue to work with the public service across a wide variety of spheres. I'm on the Qualifications Authority I chair. I'm involved in the merger of HETAC and FETAC and all of those into an entity. I've been on the Road Safety Authority and seen the magnificent work that a team of people did there. So I'm passionately for the public service. But that doesn't mean that I have rose-tinted glasses either, and I can see a lot of the challenges that are facing us. And one of my challenges here today is to try to strike a reasonable balance between recognising the real changes that have taken place and yet still identifying the opportunities or challenges that are still there. It's an area I feel, and I think it's very important, that public service reform is an area where insiders need to be constantly impatient with the pace of change. And unless we are pushing, unless we have real ambition, a lot less will be achieved than otherwise. And against this, I accept, as I criticise maybe certain aspects, that the predicament we find ourselves in today means that sometimes we have to use much cruder instruments of policy in the short term to ensure that we don't fail to deliver on our commitments under the programme of assistance. First of all, like on the credit side, I'd see that the new Department of Public Sector Reform, its existence, its creation, the appointment of both political and public sector leadership, they are there, they are driving change. We have the Minister of the Department doing it. They're going to be held accountable for success. And the fact that we have expenditure in its remit, as opposed to the old Department of Public Service, if people recall, having expenditure in its remit, I believe, means it will have both the clout to make things happen, but also it will be able to associate the reform agenda with expenditure and expenditure control. And I think that the new department has to be given credit. It has got down to work immediately with gusto. And I think the range and pace of the reform agenda, it really dwarfs a lot of what happened over 2 decades of what was the so-called SMI agenda, or delivering better government. When I left the public services, one area I felt sort of sad about it. I'd been involved in this reform agenda and we'd achieved so little over many, many years of conversations. And to echo something Patricia said in a way in the opposite direction, there was no shortage of entities asserting that great work was occurring and great achievements had been delivered. And there was no shortage of metrics to prove that really the world had been changed dramatically during that period. So I'm very, very wary of systems that self-assure the external society that everything that can be done is being done. Another great thing I feel that's useful piece to welcome is the new top-level appointments commission, the changes there. And I think that this gives a greater chance of ensuring that we have a greater and a broader range of skills at the top of our public service. And this will help us avoid maybe the excessive, that then existed, insider bias for appointments at the top. And avoiding insider bias might also help us overcome some of the groupthinks that can occur in those types of environments. I like to see the new emphasis on outputs as something I feel very positively about, and I will speak about mainly throughout today. And I see there's a much more sophisticated approach being taken to estimates, the estimates process, to issues like impact assessment, performance management, value for money. All these things are happening. And I think that last week's court decision, which is a result of a lot of hard work and a lot of effort, it paves the way for recalibration of sick pay throughout the public service. Ultimately, I think we have to look at the balance sheet, or the bottom line, that you have to strongly credit government and the new department on the macro level in bringing expenditure under control and ensuring that the public service is reducing both in size and cost. And I think that we have to acknowledge that. But I think that Robert has covered a lot of the other issues, so I don't want to just do on the credit side. I'd like to see, and I say this not as a critique, but I'd like to just suggest things that we could do further that might make a real difference. And as Robert said, and I know myself, when I've gone to dinner parties and I've met people and I've said, talked about public service reform, perhaps you're a different group and it's great, you're self-selected. But most people I've selected talk about public service reform, their eyes glaze over and they get bored. So it is sometimes difficult to talk about technocratic issues without sort of boring people. And yet when you're inside, you feel that they're so important because they have such a huge impact on our society. Nearly 1 in 6 people who work in the public services accounts for an enormous element of Ireland. And failures in it, just say like regulatory failures, the opportunity cost of doing the thing correctly can be enormous as well for our society. I've always been fascinated by what I see as one of the defining differences between the operation of systems of capitalism and communism, in that capitalism really depends upon using the market as that hidden hand, that concept of a dynamic, of a hidden hand that drives decision-taking in a decentralised way, whilst the latter depended and failed because it depended, I believe, on central planning by technocratic and bureaucratic elites. And I think that this is important. And when I think of the hidden hand, well, what could we do? I believe that we could use the accountability framework of the public sector as a hidden hand to drive behaviour. And I believe that hidden hand, if we use it properly, that accountability framework, could lead to a transformation of performance. I think if we can properly empower our public servants, if we can agree rigorous and stretching targets for them, and if we hold them fairly but also publicly to account, I think then we may ensure that their energies, their knowledge and their skill sets, they'll be focused on delivery within some reasonable budgetary allocation. Doing this requires 3 overarching things, it seems to me at least. It needs a formalised set of results or output service targets, and they can also include outcomes and impacts. We need a transparent and effective accountability process, and we need to empower those charged with delivery. Looking at the outputs, I can see the current arrangements. I've read through the estimates process, like I'm one of these nerds. I didn't read all of Mahon, but I read all of the estimates. I don't remember every last number. But building on the estimates process should be, what we should have is really is that the estimates process should flip a little bit more, and it should be an allocation proposal that contains real detail about the expenditure, but also about the targeted and what they call smart results that should be presented to the Oireachtas for approval. Now, I know we do some of this, but it's moving the Oireachtas and the appropriation more to an appropriation for than appropriation of. We go out to spend, we don't go out to buy. So it's trying to switch it more towards what we're trying to achieve. Initial aspects, as I said, are underway, but I would suggest that we need greater ambition and detail in the chosen targets being proposed. And it's also essential that the outputs should be presented along with the original target, and greater clarity on what has been achieved or otherwise. In this, the first full year of the output presentation, for those departments that did it last year, their outputs are presented against the forthcoming target, not against what the historical target was. So the 9/11 targets are not shown up against the 9/11 outputs, or the 2011 outputs. They're shown up against the 2012 future target. So you cannot align success with the target. You align future target with last year's outcome. And I think that this is a difficulty. I think, and doing this will put greater pressure on departments to provide clarity to the ministers and wider options on what outputs can be delivered with any fiscal allocation that they might get, or the envelope. And ultimately, I believe that this information should be public, so that society is aware what decisions are being taken and what choices are being made on their behalf on the use of resources. And of course, it has to be up to the Minister to decide on the outputs. I think that is absolutely at the heart of democracy, and I have great respect for the ministers I've worked with throughout my career. But I think that the accounting officer should also have to sign off and commit to delivering on those outputs. And I think that unless they sign off for the outputs, they will not be able to be held accountable. And whilst this sounds technocratic and maybe a little bit obvious, it's not trivial, because it starts going and interfering with the relationship between the senior public servant and the minister. And our system generally has been to show those as a unity and a unity of purpose, and not allow the external eyes in on what's happening. So I think that there could be a significant dynamic impact by forcing the specificity of the decision-making process out into the public. But we are doing a lot, as I said, on the outputs at the moment. But I'd say developing on these reforms of the estimates process, and this is at the heart of what I want to say today, we need to provide a full-circle accountability loop, including, most importantly, the CNAG's office in auditing the output statements and in supporting the evaluation by the relevant Oireachtas committee of each department's and office's annual report. I think it's really important. Like we've all said that, and it's important that we audit the estimates, the expenditure. That's done all the time. It's been done since whatever, 1800s. But why shouldn't we audit the outputs? Why shouldn't we audit the delivery? I mean, surely we're not spending money to spend money. We're spending scarce resources to deliver. And why not audit the delivery, which is more important? Traditionally, the CNAG was a custodial role and was designed to protect spending. And I still feel oversight of delivery is critical. The current public accountability loop for heads of departments, that's where I came from once upon a time, is very much centred on the annual report of the CNAG, an examination and their examination, the examination of the department heads by the Public Accounts Committee, by the PAC. What I would like is that each department and office will be charged with producing an annual report comprehending both inputs and outputs, as we know them. Inputs, as we know them, are expenditure, and outputs and impact indicators. And this will develop on what's already happening to a certain extent. But critically, this report will be audited by the CNAG and would provide a basis for the holding of the leadership team to account. So we move from the current system to something new. To do this, the CNAG would have to move away, and I think this is a really pernicious issue, would move away from providing a single comprehensive report, which they do at the moment, which is a 2-volume report. It's produced 9 years after the end of the accounting year. 9 months, sorry, after the end of the accounting year. I know, 9 months, 9 years nearly seems elastic after a certain stage, because a long time passed. And as you know, that the second volume provides a catalogue of problems that the audit has uncovered during the year, so-called notes to people's accounts. And this provides the media with a very focused and targeted knocking copy on the failings of the public sector. It's what I was involved in a review of the CNAG's office in 2008, and we termed it then the red meat report. And a system of audit that's centred on spending errors and failings and cataloguing them so conveniently in a single publication for our media, I believe this distorts the public sector internally, but also unfairly damages the image of the public sector externally by singling out errors without the context of the perhaps myriad successes of those departments and organisations. And then, armed with the red meat report, the PAC, it's no surprise that they will invigilate the accounting officer driven by the note to the accounts. So you can have, on one hand, you can have an innovative, driven department that scores a 10-1. They've one failing, but they've got 10 great successes. They will have a note to their account, and that will drive the attention of public scrutiny and the PAC scrutiny. And you can have another department, cute person leading it. They get a 0-0 draw, and they get away scot-free, out through the hedge, and away they go. And what does that do in a dynamic impact to the behaviours of people? Because what gets measured is what gets done. What you're held to account for is what you put your energies into frequently. And this is not to deny that there are countless people like Robert throughout the public sector trying to do a really good job. But it still has a pernicious impact throughout the system. The CNAG's remit also is centred on spending, and the CNAG cannot address the effectiveness of policy, nor can the accounting officer when being examined by the PAC. I believe that reviewing the effectiveness of policy, the relationship between outputs and outcomes, is not trivial. It's a complicated area. And it sometimes, and it most certainly can trespass the line between the public servant and the minister. And that's why it was designed originally, trying to protect that unity of purpose between the minister and the department. But I would suggest that we all must be concerned with the effectiveness of policy, and that we must move towards these outputs and impact indicators. I think that's very useful. But I think that with Ireland and its drive forward would be better served if we lift the veil on the issue and not only empowered our public servants to give a view on policy effectiveness, but to demand on them a set of outputs, a set of services and impact indicators that they will have to account for to the relevant Oireachtas Committee through their audited report and its examination. Again, I said I believe that the CNAG should audit the account, and the audit should comprehend inputs, the expenditure and outputs in the services and impact indicators included. And any comments or notes that CNAG has should be contained within the cover of the annual report of that entity, so that the failings can be properly discussed in the wider context of what's been done by the department. And this would have, this would have quite a radical change in how people work. But it would also have a significant impact, I know, on the office of CNAG, and I know a lot of colleagues who actually believe that they wouldn't be up for it. And they actually oppose the concept of CNAG auditing outputs because they don't have confidence in them to do it in a proper fashion. I wouldn't agree to that, and I believe any organisation who probably empowered and charged with a function can step up to the mark, but it would require a change. And I specifically mentioned the word relevant, or emphasised the word relevant as I spoke, the relevant committee. At the moment, we all go back to the PAC. That's the committee that takes the notes from the CNAG and examines departments.
Paul, I wonder,
sure.
No, it's just, I want to have a chance to get the audience in, so if I could ask you to.
Okay, so I'll just finish my accountability loop and I'll just touch one or two little bases then. This is results and outcome driven, so I better shut up to get a good outcome. What I would like to see is that a proper accountability loop means you go back to who you asked the money for to report how you delivered it. At the moment, the sectoral committee is the one who do the expenditure. They're the one who grant the money. They're the ones you've talked about the outputs. But you come back to the PAC, who has no real deep knowledge of the department. So everybody loves the PAC, and people say other committees of the Oireachtas fail. I would like to consider this as raising the bar for all of the Oireachtas committees, and to give them the role in future of invigilating or of discussing with the responsible person how did your department do, to discussing the notes to it, and to be supported by the CNAG's office in that work. And people feel that might be an attack on the PAC. So it would require certain levels of public sector reform to make it effective. But the sectoral department are the ones who know the department. They're the ones who currently work on the strategy and the legislation. And they're the ones who can best understand what's breaking down in the department and where the failings might be in output as well as expenditure. So I believe that we would transform it by doing that. I think that there are important elements. Like by doing this, I think we can change this accountability loop, that we can change the attention of our public servants to be more focused on delivery of outputs. I can think that we can contextualise expenditure so the debate isn't only about the cost of the public service, but it's also about what we get from the public service. And I think it would transform the capacity of the Oireachtas to hold the public sector to account, because I think this is one of the significant pieces that's broken. And unless we can empower our public sector, unless we can empower the committees to hold the public sector to account, we lack a dynamic of transformation. In my printed script, I have about 5 more minutes, but would you like to sit down now?
No, It's just I'd like to give the audience...
Yeah, sure, so would I.
I hope I'm not...
No, that's all. No, please, thank you very much.